Yeah. It's hard. Good morning. Great. Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see everyone on this beautiful Friday morning. I'm Catherine Wolfram. I'm a professor at Harvard Kennedy School right now, moving to MIT Sloan in July. I wanted to start with a couple of administrative things, and then I will introduce our phenomenal panel. This panel is organized by the World Council of Environmental and Resource Economics Associations, or WCEREA, which is comprised of a bunch of member organizations. It's AERE, it's the Asian Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, the African Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and in partnership with the Latin American Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. So the main responsibility of the World Council is soliciting and evaluating proposals to host the World Congress of Environmental and Resource Economics. But starting this year, the World Council decided that each member and partner association at each of its conferences would host a session like this that's available to all the other partner organizations. So the panel today is titled, it's the first of these WCEREA sessions for 2023, and it's titled Energy Policy in the Face of Global Stability. So please stay tuned to your email for information about other upcoming WCEREA sessions on this theme at other regional environmental and resource economics meetings around the globe. And that will give you information about how to live stream and tune into those sessions. In the coming months, the WCEREA will issue a call for expressions of interest in serving as the local organizer for the next World Congress to be held in 2026. And planning for that World Congress will begin once a local organizer is selected. If you think you or your organization might be interested in this opportunity, please reach out to AERE's WCEREA representatives, Randy Walsh or Karen Fisher-Vanden, or our Phoebe Kanduri, who is the current president of the European AERE and chair of the WCEREA. Get it? Great, thumbs up. Okay, so let's move on to this panel. I have a wonderful panel. Let me introduce them, starting to my right as Amy Myers-Jaffe. So I was looking up Amy's affiliation. I think the question isn't where is Amy, but it's where isn't Amy. Amy is everywhere. While I was in government working on oil issues, Amy was a phenomenal resource for me, and made herself very available to talk me through lots of oil issues. So thanks so much to Amy. But I think she's right now at NYU School of Professional Studies. She's also affiliated with the Columbia Global Energy Policy Center. Is that right? No, Center for, yeah, C is Center, not Columbia. Okay, CJEP. Great. So welcome, Amy. Next to Amy is Andrew Leach, who's a professor at the University of Alberta. He's been active in the Canadian government, including a stint with Environment Canada. Welcome, Andrew. Next to Andrew is Joe DeCarolis, who is the current administrator of the Energy Information Administrator, on leave from being an environmental engineering professor at North Carolina State University. I think we all know the Energy Information Administration as the source of just fonts of data. So thanks so much to Joe for coming up from DC to join us for this conference, but more than that, thanks for taking on the role in government and continuing the EIA as this extremely valuable resource. Next to Joe is Sanya Carley, who's currently at Indiana University, but headed for Penn to be the faculty director of the Climate Center for Energy Policy, also an affiliated faculty at Wharton, at the School of Planning, and one other place that I'm forgetting, and she can fill in. Sanya has done important work on energy justice issues, which I've seen, and then looking at her CV, she's done a lot of important work on other issues. So an extremely broad set of issues that she's talked about. Okay, so the prompt on this panel was to think about instability in global markets. And there have been a lot of sources of instability in global energy markets that our panelists will talk about. I'm sure we're all paying attention to the war in Ukraine involving the world's largest energy exporter, Russia. There have been recent climate disruptions to energy markets, the droughts in the Western US, the droughts in Europe that prevented coal boats, barges from reaching their destinations. So lots and lots to talk about. What we're going to do is start with a couple of minutes of remarks from each of the panelists. Then I will ask questions of the panelists. They can ask questions of each other, but definitely leave a lot of time for audience Q&A. So please be thinking of questions, and we will have time for them at the end of the panel. All right, so why don't we start with Amy, who I think is going to talk about oil markets and the war in particular. Do you want to stand?
Okay, well, hard to talk about the war in 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk really, really fast. So a couple key points. Number one, except for that little bit in the beginning, at the very start of the invasion, where we had the oil market had to reorganize itself to shift oil from Russia to the Asian markets and to Turkey, we really actually had zero oil losing from the market, right? Because in the end, whatever volume that was, maybe there was 1 million barrels a day lost for some short period of time. It was overcompensated by the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so we didn't really actually have a shortfall in oil. Natural gas, very different. The amount of pipeline gas that's still shut off from the normal practice of global gas is the equivalent of 20% of the LNG traded worldwide, so still a big disruption. Why hasn't it felt like more of a crisis? And then I'm going to talk about where it has been a crisis. So why it hasn't been more of a crisis, which is a telling feature, which I'm going to throw out for discussion, is that in the first year, 2022, as this was all taking place, Europe actually installed 50 gigawatts of renewable energy in 1 year. They installed 2.8 million heat pumps, again, in 1 year. So and they were helped by the weather. That was, 18 BCM they didn't need because it was mild. But the bottom line is, as some of you know who know me, I've written a lot about the oil cycle and its interconnection with geopolitics and banking crises. And we're, in my opinion, in the same exact setting. We had oil revenues pile up in Russia. They spent them on weaponry, which is what happened in past Saddam Hussein in Iraq and so forth. Different times we've seen this kind of similar problem. Attacks a neighbor, which we've seen, similar problem. Oil goes up, gas goes up, inflationary pressure, Fed steps in. Fed raises interest rates. We start to have banking crises because of the, whatever. And now we're in the aren't we going to have a recession problem yet again? And we still have a war. So to me, this Russian invasion fits my paradigm, which I didn't bring slides because we're, having a discussion that I could show you goes back to 1956. So we're not out of it yet. So the question is, and here's the point. Given how much renewables Europe was able to put in 1 year, and energy efficiency, which I can go over with digital, are we to the point now where crises will be less severe and less prolonged because oil is now elastic, right? So have we moved away from the idea that oil is an inelastic commodity? And here am I'm going to give 4 points why I think that will happen over time. One, to do energy efficiency now, I can use software. I don't have to do building stuff. So that's already a gain. So I can reduce demand almost instantaneously. Lot of commercial alternatives that I could suddenly buy. I bought an electric car, for example. So I have these alternative things for my household or for my vehicle that I can buy now. I have the choice. 3, we were already decoupling oil use and GDP in the OECD. Now that's going to start to happen in China and possibly other places over time. And so as oil prices do have a shock, because I'm not sure we're out of the oil revenue and war pattern, the macro impact hopefully could become smaller over time. And the last thing is, one of the things that propels this crisis is that state governments have a lot of oil revenue and they spend it on arms. But if you look at the development planning now in UAE and Saudi Arabia and places like that, they actually can absorb a lot of the money into their own economies in modernizing their economies. And so there's less petrodollars slushing around. That's a good thing from the point of view of the inflation and the cycle and asset inflation. It's a bad thing because we usually get the countries in the Gulf to bail out the banks when they're failing. Okay, those are my controversial remarks. We move on.
Sorry. All right, well, thanks for the invitation. I want to talk about three things uncertainty-wise that are affecting Canada, and particularly with links to climate policy, which is most of where I live in Canada. Physically, I live in Alberta, which is home to Canada's large share of Canada's fossil fuel industry, oil sands or tar sands, if you prefer, et cetera. I won't now be allowed back in the country because I said that. But the three sources of uncertainty I want to think about are the global market impacts, and particularly how those have reflected back on Canadian policy, some technological uncertainty that Amy just talked about some of the technological changes, but I think there's an uncertainty aspect there that's important. And then maybe a little bit of political uncertainty and how that feeds into investment, and try to link it back in particular for people still building research agendas to some ways that might influence your work in the future. So on the global side, Amy characterized this well, right? We had massive change in the world oil and regional certainly, but also world gas markets. But I want to take you back a little bit further to 2015, where we had another large disruption in the oil market, which maybe cuts against Amy's view of the inelasticity or the elasticity of the market, where we had a massive price drop. And we had this sort of consensus that was evolving in Canada where, okay, that was the end of the oil boom. We're done. It's sort of a wind down of new projects. No new projects hit final investment decision. The kind of oil project construction economy that had existed in Canada started to disappear. And then all of a sudden you have a little bit of a wind up into 2020, then the pandemic hits. And there's a lot of, well, look, you got to pay people to take oil. The thing is over, give it up. And then Russia invades Ukraine, prices spike for both oil and gas. We have a huge demand, not just for oil globally, but in particular for LNG infrastructure that flashes back into the Canadian economy and into Canadian politics now, as it's the Canadian government that's standing in the way of developing these resources that in particular Europe and our allies need. So you ended up with sort of a re-emergence of petronationalism, almost petromilitarism, that this was our allied war effort. And we just weren't able, when the Germans came to Canada and said, can you get us LNG? And, to a first order approximation, our response was, well, we have a new Impact Assessment Act, and we'll have to put these projects through, years of assessment. And it just wasn't a very satisfactory response. So, then, of course, the second piece that you have is the inflation that followed both the pandemic and the war, which, when you have an economy that is, for those of you that don't know, Canada's carbon prices are escalating rapidly. So we've gone from 30 bucks a ton in 2020, we're 65 bucks a ton today. We've got a schedule locked into 170 bucks a ton by 2030 Canadian. But nonetheless, the rate still is important. So it's about 52 cents American, as I understand it. But in a world where prices are escalating for gasoline for other reasons, then all of a sudden you see governments coming under big pressure. So, for example, my home province of Alberta, we eliminated all our fuel taxes as affordability measures. We started to do on-bill credits for electricity and natural gas consumption, subsidizing utilities out of tax revenue. So huge impact there. Second thing, technological uncertainty. So electricity, we've heard tons of great presentations over the last couple of days about electricity progress, and hear a lot about batteries and all of these things. Northern latitude country is very different, and Canada, very clean electricity grid, sort of a third maybe of the emissions intensity of the US, but geographically very dispersed. So what we've seen from the technology uncertainty is a push that says, hey, it's really easy to decarbonize, or relatively easy to decarbonize right now. And I think not enough emphasis on the challenges of being in a northern latitude country and thinking of seasonal storage as opposed to daily shift kind of storage presents, and the barriers we have to new transmission. I won't talk much about that because I think we're going to hear more about some stuff on that later on. The last thing though that I'll highlight is the political uncertainty that's fed in as a result of some of these changes, is that we now have a little bit of the rise of kind of populist nationalism that you would have seen with the collapse of the mid-continent manufacturing sector kind of pre-Trump. We're seeing a lot more of that come, that was sort of buffered in Canada by the oil industry and the rise of the oil sands industry that essentially softened the blow of all that. We're seeing that come back now, and we're seeing a lot of push directly on carbon policy, impact assessment policy, infrastructure evaluation policies, et cetera. And this has blown back into companies' abatement decisions, which I think will be interesting. Anybody that works on carbon pricing questions is, the question we would normally say is, oh yeah, it's obvious, set tax equal marginal abatement costs, figure out your life. But of course, what's going on in Canada is you have companies looking at major long-term capital investments that are saying, no, what I want to know is the expected future abatement cost or avoided carbon tax versus my levelized cost over a multi-year horizon of abatement, and deciding, you know what, there's just not enough incentive here. So we have an interesting situation going on where we have a high and rising carbon price, and you have all of the business sitting on the sidelines and not doing any investment. And so you have a carbon price that isn't as effective as we might have hoped, and you have a lot of populist pushback against it, which is creating more uncertainty around the carbon price. So 3 sources of huge uncertainty kind of amplified by the war. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. It's an honor to be here. So in my opening remarks, I kind of took an expansive and long-term view. And what I did was, what I want to do is lay out some of the key factors that I think can drive change and affect the trajectory of the global energy system over the next few decades. And as I was putting this list together, I kind of thought about it in the context of 3 interrelated global challenges. The first is security of supply. Another is climate change mitigation. And then the third is affordability and accessibility of energy. So with all of these factors that I'm going to list, they all come with uncertainty and the potential for future shocks. So here's what I've got. Here's the list. The first is weather and climate. If we're thinking about like day to month or seasonal, weather actually matters a lot. Weather affects demand, and that in turn affects inventory levels. So when we're thinking about inventory levels for stored natural gas or crude oil or refined products, inventory levels are going to determine, they partially determine price. And then in the longer term, climate, right? We have climate change that's going to affect end use demands as well as other climate impacts that our energy system is going to have to contend with. There's prevailing macroeconomic conditions, of course, and that is going to affect the appetite and ambition for change to the energy system. There's, of course, as we've heard, geopolitical considerations. So, Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, trade with China, those are front of mind right now. But again, as you think out over multiple decades, there's lots of other issues that are likely to crop up. Related to that is trade of energy commodities and materials. And at a high level, is the world going to be more cooperative or more insular? An example is critical mineral supply. We need lots of cobalt and lithium and manganese and nickel and copper for clean energy technologies. How are those supply chains going to develop over the next couple decades? There's technology innovation. We've seen really significant declines in the cost of wind and solar and lithium ion batteries. Does that continue? Will we be surprised? Are there technologies that are just right now on the horizon or that we're not even anticipating at all right now that might emerge and shape our future path? There's power systems operation. So we can see that in the short term, worldwide, we're seeing a move towards electric power systems with a higher penetration of renewables. We need to make sure we can operate those systems. And in particular, I'm thinking about storage. So I think we're pretty good at using batteries, for example, to balance supply and demand diurnally. But as we move to higher penetrations of renewables, we need to think about longer term seasonal storage. Perhaps that's hydrogen, but that remains to be seen. There's a management of fossil fuel infrastructure, you know, building on Amy's comment about does oil demand become more elastic? I mean, how do we think about maintaining that vast infrastructure as well as making investments in a system that's in transition? Permitting and regulations obviously is a huge topic in the United States right now. Does that help or hinder the anticipated build out of new infrastructure? And then policy ambition. You know, we've seen a lot of recent policy action, including the IRA in the United States. But if the ambition is for net zero by mid-century, we still have a long way to go. And what form does that policy take? Does it continue to look like industrial policy, or is it focused on minimizing emissions at least cost? What shape does that policy take? And then related to that is the public mood and the appetite for change. That's going to bear heavily on the policy discussion. And also the public's willingness to accept new technologies, particularly the technologies that they need to interact with. So are they going to be broadly accepting of electric vehicles and heat pumps and so forth at the scale that would be required of a net zero system? And then, of course, if there are massive infrastructure changes, we really need to think about the community level impacts. You know, who's going to be impacted by all these changes? And I know Sanya's going to address that. And then, of course, there's wild cards. There's one thing I've learned. It's to be very humble in the face of future uncertainty. There's going to be things that are going to be total surprises that policymakers are going to need to be aware of. One key point is that time frame matters, right? So if I'm only thinking a month or a season ahead, the uncertainty that I worry about is more constrained. And as I think about longer time frames, the consideration of uncertainty expands. And then final point, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing at EIA. So at EIA, we have the unique authority to collect energy data across the system. And I think our challenge is to continually adjust our survey collections to make sure that they reflect the changes that we're seeing in the current system. The other thing is we need to update our long-term modeling work. I come from an academic background where I was an energy system modeler. I've been saying from day one that we need to be able to examine a wider range of future scenarios. And so to that end, we've started development of an open source next generation modeling framework that I hope does a better job trying to address some of the factors that I just mentioned. So.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here in this maybe the most beautiful conference room I've ever been in. I think the orange is amazing. So we went in alphabetical order by first name, and it just so happens that we started at the most massive global scale, and now we're going to go all the way to the very local population, local household. So it worked out great in terms of our parents naming us. So I'm going to build on Joe's 4 major themes or major things that are happening. So major trends that are ongoing right now within our energy markets. The first is the energy decarbonization and the transition to clean energy, low carbon, more efficient, more advanced technologies. The second is climate change, of course, that is impacting all populations across the world, but some of them far more than others. The third is infrastructure expansion and the need for significant infrastructure investment and expansion and coordination across countries, across individuals, communities, in order to make this infrastructure happen. And lastly, extreme supply chain disruptions that started or that came about as part of the pandemic, but also have been exacerbated by some of the trends that Amy talked about. So all of these trends affect the economy, they affect our energy markets, and they affect people. They affect specific populations in particular and in disparate ways. And in fact, some of the major impacts might be an increase in the price of energy. In fact, all 4 of these trends are very likely to increase the cost of energy for all consumers across the world. And there are these disparate social and economic impacts that we need to be mindful of. And so here, I'm going to take the maybe unpopular approach of using the energy justice framework. So here, the energy justice framework has 3 tenets. It's distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. So distributive justice is thinking about the distribution of our benefits and burdens. So for our energy systems, our benefits might come in the form of technologies, for example, or employment opportunities or other kinds of opportunities, right? And the burdens might come in the form of various externalities, air pollution, water pollution, And we know through empirical literature that historically our energy systems have had a disparate burden on certain populations, particularly low-income populations and communities of color have borne a greater share of air pollution, water pollution, have lived closer to power plants, have lived closer to mobile sources of pollution. When we think about the benefits of our energy systems, we think about these technologies, and we've talked about a few of them and how important it is that we adopt them, and that we think about, as Amy talked about, adopting our electric vehicles, for example. But the literature here shows that there are extreme disparities in who actually has access to these technologies across the world and within the United States. We know this in the case of solar, of electric vehicles, of batteries, of smart thermostats, of smart efficient appliances, and so much more, including even the LED light bulb, the smallest technology that exists. And Tony Ream's work shows that there's actually the equivalent of a food desert when it comes to LED light bulbs, that there are certain places, particularly low-income places, communities of color, where they can't access the simplest thing as an efficient light bulb. We also know that the distribution of employment is highly uneven. There's only about 15% of the total employment in the energy industry that is held by women, for example. When we think about procedural justice, that's who's involved in our decision-making processes, who is at the proverbial table, who is allowed to lead, who has a voice, who has access to the modeling infrastructure that Joe is working on, who is able to be the analyst, who's included in the analysis teams, who is on that government team as they're working on their RIA, for example. So who's involved? And we know, again, from empirical literature that there are certain communities, particularly less affluent communities, that are unable to access these decision-making processes. And third, in recognition justice, that has to do with recognizing these various disparities across these energy justice tenets, but also recognizing it in the past sense, the present sense, and as we move forward to our clean energy transition and cleaner energy systems worldwide, that we need to think about not just the disparities in who has access, for example, to different technologies, but how our institutional and our social structures might dictate and forever ingrain these disparities in society. So many of these communities, many communities, I would say, across the United States, as well as the world, face various dimensions of these injustices or inequities within our energy system. And these four major trends that are all happening at the same time and colliding essentially are going to, or are poised to make some of these inequities worse unless we are very deliberate about how we proceed, right? Even Andrew's point about some of the things that the Canadian government has done to really help households and to think deeply before this problem gets out of control. Now, I'll just highlight a specific case here, and that is the case of low-income populations, and specifically low-income populations that face the incidence of energy insecurity or energy poverty. And what this is essentially an inability of a household or an individual to provide for their basic energy needs or to keep their house at a temperature that is comfortable or survivable. And what we know from our research, the research at the Energy Justice Lab, is that low-income populations are significantly more likely to be energy insecure within the United States as well as across the world. And that as a result, they face higher energy burdens and they might suffer disproportionately. We also know empirically that they're the most likely to have been chronically exposed to air pollution, to water pollution, and to be very connected to, as I noted before, power plants and mobile sources of air pollution, and that they are the most poised to benefit from clean energy technologies, but yet have the least access to them. So this is one demographic population within the United States that faces so many of these different disparities. And when we're thinking about consumer price impacts, we know that for the average American, we might be able to absorb these prices, right? We might be able to take on an additional $10, $20, $50 on our energy bills. But for those who live on the margins, those who face such extreme budget constraints, when prices rise, this is the difference between having access to energy and not having access to energy, being disconnected or being connected. Or in the case of substitutability, unfortunately for essential goods, it might mean a household who has access to food or doesn't have access to food if they need to pay for their energy bill. So the Energy Justice Lab focuses a lot on energy insecurity. And some of the things that we found is that when households are energy insecure, they tend to cut back on other goods such as medical needs and food, right? They have deleterious educational outcomes. There are developmental delays for young children who live in these homes. We also know that child services is more likely to remove a child from a home if the home is disconnected from the service provider. We know that there are mental and physical health consequences for anybody who lives within a home that is disconnected or when they're struggling to keep their house warm. And this can, in extreme cases, but not at all rare cases, lead to death if somebody's facing such extreme temperatures. We also know that households engage in risky coping strategies. So in a recent study of ours, we found that more than half of low-income households within the United States engage in some kind of financial or behavioral coping strategy to keep their bodies warm. Now, this might be more extreme risky temperature behavior, such as burning trash in your home or using your oven for space heat. It might be less extreme, such as asking somebody for help, asking friends or family for help, or taking on debt. But this is a very prevalent condition. And we also know that households therefore face the imminent threat of utility disconnection. And a bit of a shameless plug, our lab is within a week's time about to launch a disconnection dashboard, utilitydisconnections.org, which is actually live at the moment, unless you all crash it by going on right a week before the launch. And we found that in 2022, over 3 million households were disconnected by their utility service provider. And that's using only half of the utilities that exist across the United States, those that have provided data. So I have a lot of thoughts on solutions and what we can do about this specific problem, as well as other vulnerable populations within the energy transition and climate change, but I'll save those for Q&A.
Great, thank you all. Well, Sanya teed up the next set of questions that I wanted to get to, and the rest of the panelists have laid the groundwork really well, establishing the insecurity and instability that we're facing from the geopolitical down to the household level. But I did want to turn to policy. So are there things that policymakers should be doing differently in the face of increasing instability? Are there threats to existing policies that haven't existed before that we should be paying attention to? I'll take the moderator's prerogative. I mean, to my mind, there are a couple of things that I think are good examples. So for instance, in the Inflation Reduction Act, starting in 2025, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit are completely flexible. I mean, it's a credit for clean energy. Whatever technology you use, you get the tax credit. So that just builds in some expectation that technologies will evolve, that we don't know what technologies will exist 10 years from now, and we want to build in that flexibility. So, you know, is that an example of how we can use policy in creative ways to respond to increasing instability? Hopefully the panelists have other ideas, but since this microphone's so clunky, maybe we can just go down the line and start with Amy. Also, I'll invite you to respond to the other panelists if you want at this point.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have not responded to, which we didn't actually discuss, but kind of tease into Carley's point, is that here in the United States, we don't actually have an agency that responds to communities that will have negative effects from climate that is slow onset and not just an emergency, right? So we have no agency, no planning, no data about locations where more and more services are going to be needed to help people cope with changes in temperature, with fire, with things that we know are coming, lack of water, so forth. So that would be on the US side. Globally, I recently did an exercise for the UN Commission on Africa, and it produced what I'm sure if you're in the field might not have been shocking, but I found it shocking, which is that the way adaptation assistance is given out through the multiple agencies run by the UN and the World Bank and so forth is completely disconnected from any of the indexes that tells you what countries are most vulnerable now, and certainly what countries are going to be most vulnerable in the future, even though we have that data and we know what it is. So basically, the OECD gives out a limited amount, only 13% of all money given out for climate assistance globally actually goes to adaptation projects. And that includes food security, agriculture, water, irrigation, so forth. And of that, of the countries that are most vulnerable, a lot of those countries get zero assistance because they don't even have the capability to assess how climate change is going to affect them. And of the aid that goes out, which every single country in their national, in Africa anyway, in their national determined contribution assessment of adaptation needs. Almost every country in Africa says agriculture is their highest and most important place for needing assistance. And again, I forget the exact statistic, but most of the assistance does not go to agriculture. And to give you an idea, the country on the African continent that gets the most assistance for climate change is Morocco. So not even in sub-Saharan Africa, where the impacts have been, quite severe with flooding, so forth. So to me, that's sort of a policy area where we're not getting out ahead of even doing an assessment and numbers. We have no numbers, ideas of how many people have had to migrate in the United States based on climate change. We don't have a planning or assessment agency to think about what we're going to do. Last comment, a couple of years ago, I taught this class that was on the subject of sustainability and climate response. Used to take students to Africa. And then we had a very dangerous year in Africa. So I took the students to Alaska instead. And the lack of planning in Alaska for how to relocate communities that are no longer going to be able to stay where they are, and the lack of funding for that was really pretty shocking. So just throwing it out there.
So Catherine brought up the IRA, and I think that's been had a really interesting impact in Canada, and one that I think would be interesting to economists, because of course we have this, 25 cents US per ton carbon policy. No, it multiplied by 0.75 today, I think. So we have a significant economy-wide carbon price, but then the pressure that we've come under because of the IRA is essentially to create an entirely new architecture that looks kind of like that. So despite the fact that, if you look forward, the expected value of abatement is probably higher in Canada if you take that carbon pricing schedule for granted, we now have, a lineup of companies at government's door saying, I want that. I want that treatment. I don't necessarily want you to get rid of the carbon price that I can also benefit from, but I want to stack all of these treatments one on top of the other. So we have, if you were, I'll use an oil sands example, right now under the oil sands, you're subject to at least 2 pricing frameworks. So a clean fuel regulation, the national carbon price on your emissions. We're also thinking of introducing another pricing mechanism to cap oil and gas emissions. We have tax credits on clean capital. We now have tax credits on carbon capture and storage to match 45Q. We have this incredibly complex layering of policies that I don't think anyone knows which way is up, and I don't think anyone knows when they should pull the trigger on investment. So I think that's really creating sort of a magnified uncertainty. And of course, the US is so much bigger than we are that it influences all of our energy policy decisions in a way that wouldn't, you didn't have to adapt, you didn't face much pressure to adopt a carbon price when we had one. So, it's a really asymmetric piece. The other thing I'll say, just, and since Sanya, you brought it up, one of the things that our government did, or I brought it up and then you reinforced it, was do essentially a deferral account. Catherine, I'm in your wheelhouse here, a deferral account for utility rates to help people with the huge inflationary pressure. But here's the little tweak of the policy is it's a deferral account. So it was going to be paid back by rates later on, but only through the regulatory rate. Who is constrained to the regulatory rate? Consumers that don't have a credit history, that have a history of disconnection, or that have a history of non-payment, potentially rental apartments, no billing history. So you have a, multi-tens of millions of dollar deferral for everybody, or everybody that was on the regulated rate, and all the people with means can exit paying that and dump it all onto the most vulnerable consumers. So what seemed like a policy and was pitched as a policy to help vulnerable consumers is actually one that's all going to land in their lap, not what was originally intended. So I think those are things we really need to focus on.
Thanks. I guess what I would add is I get the strong sense that with regard to policy, we're in a period of experimentation, and there's just a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to play out. You know, I guess what I would say, again, from the EIA perspective is, you know, we view our role as, you know, collecting data that kind of sets a baseline for policy. And in terms of, you know, what policymakers should be thinking about or anticipating, maybe it's just, you know, my background as a modeler, but you know, what I want to be able to do is like take all those factors and figure out how you can put it into a model, into a self-consistent framework that allows you to play out different scenarios to see what might happen. But I think my sense is, with regard to policy globally, we're just in a period of uncertainty and experimentation.
I think I'm going to advocate actually for the layering approach. I think that it's important for us to have multiple different types of policies to attack multiple and complex and overlapping challenges. So I'll continue the thread of thinking about energy and secure populations to think through some of the policy interventions. One thing that I've found in my research is that once a household is disconnected, their likelihood of being disconnected again and again goes up, right? It becomes this persistent cycle. And so I think it's really important to think about preventative solutions for households, particularly as we are on the verge or as we are facing all of these massive trends that will fundamentally change our energy system. So preventative solutions, I think, include things such as weatherization improvement, energy efficiency improvement, residential solar. For example, these are things that can help reduce energy bills for a household and help them avoid that persistent cycle. I think we also need to continue to provide relief. The government needs to provide relief. I think it's important for utilities to provide relief when they can as well. But it's not just an issue of increasing funding, for example, for the low-income home energy assistance program or the weatherization assistance program, but it also means thinking deeply with a public administration lens about the administrative burdens of these types of programs and how to reduce the burdens and make it more clear, frankly, as to how one can access these policies. And then lastly, I'll say we should think much more deeply about disconnection protections and how they're designed. And in the face of climate change, I think it's really important for state governments to update these disconnection protections, recognizing that weather is changing very, very quickly, and more extreme weather events are happening so much more often. It also means protecting more vulnerable populations, such as households with children. Currently, only 4 states have protections for households with children. So I think being more creative with our solutions and having a layering effect, even for a very specific issue such as energy and security, is important.
Add one thing. There were a couple of communities that have experimented, because also in transportation, there's a whole class of Americans, for example, who are left to take public transportation in the bus area. And then the service is very poor, and then service becomes worse because there's fewer and fewer people taking it. And one of the things that some communities have done around Massachusetts and some other locations is they've made public transportation free so that people would use it. And then they actually budget the cost of public transportation into their city budget or whatever. Massachusetts has looked at making that broader. Maybe in the end, when we think about electricity, we should be thinking about a means test, where certain means tests in certain climate situations where electricity should also be free to certain level of households, instead of facing disconnection. And we should be thinking about our budgets in a way where, same as some of these cities where they are budgeting to run the bus service for free, maybe we need to be thinking about electricity in the same way.
Great. So I want to, at this point, try to expand the discussion a little bit, especially in the spirit of the World Council of Environmental and Resource Economics Associations, and think about populations around the world. So we've talked about marginalized populations in the US, but there are, I remember talking to someone from Africa once who said, we can't decarbonize. We haven't carbonized yet. We have to carbonize first. We need energy. So, we don't have energy insecurity because we don't have much energy use, or many people in our country don't have much energy use. And I guess related to this, Joe brought up the concept, are we going to move to kind of world cooperation, or are we going to all devolve into insular economies? And, in the energy space, maybe going with renewables makes us more insular because we get local wind and sun. We don't need to trade with Russia or with Mozambique for gas. So, I guess I'd like to invite the panel to comment on how they see things evolving and how things evolving globally and how they see that impacting marginalized populations around the world.
Okay, that's a tough one. I agree that renewables can be more local. And as we've seen with the Russia crisis, consumers themselves can take matters into their own hands if they have means. And I can make my whole house an island, or a community can make the whole community have their own energy solution. So I think we'll probably see more of that, not less of that. But the other thing that's happening, which I have a project now with the Penn State and Rice, where we're looking at electricity coercion, because one of the ways to balance renewables, of course, is to use an imbalanced market. So Canada has a lot of hydro. We finally figured out a way to permit a wire to New England. So you have more electricity trade. And from a US point of view, geopolitically, that's an interesting question. Because as you have more electricity trade among countries, say in Europe and so forth, which we're seeing already, do you have to worry about cyber? What are the other systems that you have to think about when trade's going to move to electricity and away from these other kinds of commodities? I do think that will happen over time. And people have argued this, but no one's really modeled it well. This idea that I can have, which happened with Russia, that if I closed coal plants, but I didn't dismantle them, then I could turn them back on in some kind of national emergency if I had to temporarily, right? And so maybe the shift to renewables and electrification gives us more security because if we kept a certain amount of backup power, we'd have more ability to respond.
So I'm going to come back to something I said earlier on northern latitudes and talk a little bit about remote communities in northern Canada, because when I think about solar and batteries, et cetera, one of the key innovations that it's created is now you can have almost anywhere in the world, at least at the closer you get to the equator anyway, you can have reliable 8-hour local electricity in a way that you could not have possibly imagined, cheap electricity in a way that you could not have possibly imagined 2 decades ago. That problem changes dramatically when you get to some of the remote communities in northern Canada where they are winter peaking energy systems almost to the extreme. You have 24-hour sunlight during the summer, but you don't have a big cooling load. You have essentially zero sunlight in the winter, maybe some cases 2, 3, 4 hours of sunlight in the winter. And that's where your massive heating load kicks in. And so getting off fossil fuels in those regions is a lot more challenging, and that risk is amplified by climate change. Talk about energy security. A lot of the transportation into some of these communities is by winter roads. So you're moving diesel fuel in by trucks on an ice road where the season for that ice road is shrinking. And you also have now wildfire risk that is amplifying some of these concerns as well. So we don't have to go that far from here to think about communities that are in exactly that situation. They've been sort of not industrialized to the same degree as we would think for a lot of North America, but they really are dependent in a different way on the reliability and dispatchability of fossil fuel energy. And in some ways, some of the new energy solutions that we might think for some economies would allow them to almost leapfrog that carbonization, those don't necessarily work in northern remote communities. And so I think that's a source of a lot of uncertainty and work to be done.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think it's, I was taking notes here. It's really hard for me to come up with an overarching narrative. I mean, I think it really depends on, on the marginalized population that we're talking about, where they are, what the circumstances are. I think in general, it's certainly possible for countries that are underdeveloped with energy infrastructure to leapfrog and to, for example, install distributed renewables. But whether that makes sense relative to fossil infrastructure, again, I think it really depends on all of the details of that system. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
If decarbonization and greenhouse gas abatement is our objective, I think that it's absolutely essential that we expand renewable energy, low carbon energy across the world. However, it's so much easier said than done, right? There was just an article out this morning that I read about how the majority of the money that's gone towards climate commitments from industrialized countries towards developing countries has gone towards projects such as power plant projects, fossil fuel projects, right? But let me be a Debbie Downer a little bit more and think about particularly vulnerable populations. When we're thinking about our clean energy technologies and we think about the life cycle of our technologies, I argue that it's oftentimes at the tails, the front and the back end, where we see some of the most egregious human rights violations and other complications. So that is, take an electric vehicle, for example, consider a battery. Well, we need to extract the minerals for that battery. And at the tail end, we need to dispose of the electronic waste. And we know that there are places in the world that essentially bear the burdens of this extraction and this waste, right? So with the extraction, the Democratic Republic of Congo extracts or produces the majority of our cobalt, essentially, that's used in batteries, and they face, many of these communities, especially the artisanal miners, face extreme conditions that affect their personal health. And on the back end, the electronic waste, these deposit sites, there's one that's been big in Ghana, for example, near a yam market. It's since dispersed and it's placed in more decentralized places across the world, but those communities, those populations that work within these electronic waste facilities are exposed to very harmful pollutants that are connected to these batteries. So as we're thinking through this deployment strategy with clean energy technologies, I encourage us to also think through the individual, really building on Andrew's point, these individual communities that might face some of these bigger burdens.
Okay, this is my last question to the panelists, so get ready. We're coming for the audience questions. Like you I guess for one thing, I was encouraged, Amy, several of the panelists at the question about policy responses was we need to collect more data and do more research. So I think for a research community, that's a encouraging answer that what we are doing is going to be more and more valuable as things change. We'll have a lot to keep up with. So I guess I just want to invite the panelists to address key areas that they think are being undervalued or that academics are paying too little attention to, just areas that they see as growth areas for future research.
Okay, so I want to mention an area that's not an area, it's more because I have Joe here and Nemitz definitely needs to be updated. So one of the interesting things that some universities are doing, I think Maryland and CMU and Michigan have a consortium, and we did it when I was at UC Davis, is to get, so when I say interdisciplinary, I don't mean you do a consumer choice model and throw the data into an energy systems model. I mean, you have an integrated model. So we did one model at Davis, where we use geospatial data of the entire US highway system and then used comp science nodal analysis to make a flows model that had an optimization solution, which is also kind of an engineering solution, but inside it was econometrics for the price of natural gas, hydrogen, and other kinds of alternative fuels, renewable natural gas. And we made solutions that when you spit out the answer for the state of California, in our case, the solution came out, the answer came out in a map. So I could really show you where the resource was, what the cost was, where the stations should be built, and how that network proceed, and how many over time, scaling, how the scaling would take place geolocated, right? And it discovered this really interesting thing, which is the trucking in California doesn't go alternative routes, that only goes north to south on one highway. And therefore the cost for the state of California to subsidize stations and alternative fuels for trucks was unbelievably low. and that it would eventually, spread to Vegas and other places. So that was a really interesting outcome, using different methodologies in one model. And so it took some really good data people, but from different fields. We had a student from ag economics working with a student from comp science, and it was a great outcome. So I just wanted to throw out there for academics that we are having more and more complex problems where we're needing to work, and working with a comp scientist can really be quite constructive if you're an economist. So I work with a comp scientist at Tufts named Deborah Sunter, and taking census data and other kinds of giant data sets in terms of giving you more information on people's incomes, where they live. You can kind of have some ethnic profile of a population based on at least some kind of geographic location using geolocation. That there are these means that we haven't pushed ourselves to do. That would actually help you really actually provide policymakers with very detailed analysis of the justice issue. That means we have to stretch outside economics. So just throwing that out there as a methodology statement.
I think the big thing you've heard all the way along here is different countries have different circumstances, different populations have different circumstances. So I think of it, I mean, we're now, I think, much better at thinking of policy implications, a distribution function of policy implications, as opposed to, single measures. And I think it's just adding axes to that distribution plot and starting to think about whether it's gender-based analysis, whether it's First Nations versus non, whether it's geographic, what the dimensions are of, or income stratification, of course, what the dimensions are of those policy impacts, and then driving that back one further step to start talking about objectives. So I'll give you a concrete example. I helped develop Alberta's carbon pricing policy. The first day that I met with the premier, and this is on recording, so I will try not to get myself in trouble. But her reaction, I don't think she would be annoyed with me for saying this, was, we can't do a carbon price, it's regressive. And kudos to her for saying that. But I said, what if we could make it a progressive policy? What if we could design a rebate regime where more than 70% of the population would be made better off? She said, okay, I'm listening. And that conversation was what changed the ability to do carbon pricing. Now, that same thing has been weaponized to be used to say, are there any populations that are made better off made worse off? And as an economist, I think what I missed was the distributions within income groups. So we said, the average person in the low income group is made better off. That didn't mean there wasn't a distribution within that low income decile or percent or quartile that was made substantially worse off. And so getting that, within group detail is super important.
I guess I would just echo what Amy was saying. I think we need to, I guess at EIA, in the context of thinking about a next generation framework, we're starting to think about sector by sector, what really are the governing dynamics? And, most of these models, they either do cost minimization or welfare maximization. There's like single agent models, and we need to be a lot more sophisticated in how we approach that. The other thing too is we do need a lot more granularity, and I think the policies like the IRA are demanding it. And I'll give you two examples of where this is really a challenge for us right now at EIA with the NEMS model. There are bonus credits for energy communities, and we can so basically if the clean energy infrastructure is located in what's defined as an energy community, there are bonus credits available. I mean, we just varied that bonus credit parametrically. So we produced a separate report that said, well, depending on how much of this infrastructure is built, we'll see this much more deployed, but we didn't actually have a sense for the geography of that. Another example is there are tax credits for low income households. We don't have a sense of income distribution within our end use demand models. So these are all things we need to be able to do. And it's an exciting time. I mean, I think there's a real need to develop these capabilities. Again, the policy's demanding it, and it has to be balanced against computational performance. And I think we want to move away from running models to produce a single result, right? Because there can be a lot of false precision in model results. So it's got to be really granular. It's got to be computationally tractable, and we've got to be able to run the model a lot of times under different assumptions to see what insights we can get when we vary those assumptions.
I'll just continue to build off of everybody because, you know, our parents was great. I'm going to encourage us, particularly picking up on Amy's point, I'm going to encourage us to put together equity and decarbonization, or rather efficiency objectives within our research. And I know that this is hard to stomach. If one might say efficiency is the primary objective, we can then study on the back end, right? We can do our robustness check. We can do our heterogeneity of results at the end of our paper. But I'm going to encourage us to move that up, and not just to the front of the paper, but to inform the actual research questions that we're asking, so that equity isn't, or the distributional equity isn't the last thing that we think about before we conclude the paper, right? So what does this look like? Well, or how does this manifest? I encourage us to think about wearing equity as goggles or glasses that we're looking through, and then we ask our question, where our objective could be efficiency. I think that we also need to think of creative ways to introduce equity into modeling, in particular, thinking about the human dimensions, the behavioral dimensions, and what does that look like for equity. I think we need to think hard about government tools that are available and how much equity is ingrained in the government tools that inform our decision making, right? Is it acceptable, for example, to have entire sacrifice zones? We've talked about a few different sacrifice zones, such as mineral extraction, for example, of an entire community that might be facing health consequences. Well, that's a sacrifice zone. And do we account for that within our policy interventions? Do we have a mechanism within our government tools? I'd also encourage us to think about creative solutions to structural and institutional challenges that we face. If we're thinking about our energy markets, this means thinking deeply about the structure of our markets, the design of our markets, and the design of our rates, for example, that really govern how, you know, people are able to access energy, for example, pay for energy or access technologies.
All right. So I'm not sure, is there a microphone floating around in the audience? Oh, okay. All right. So just stand up, raise your hand and ask the question, and I'll try to summarize it. Yes, I see one hand there. Maybe stand up so I can see you, please.
So I have two questions. So the first one is this one. Can we see, one form of uncertainty that we cannot talk about for post-transition is a naturalist disaster. When you have a naturalist disaster, this destroys the renewable systems very quickly. Electric grid or wind power, right? But all is already there for us just after the disaster. So can we still view all like an insurance, to have some insurance value? So can we see all like an insurance asset, just to prevent when you have like hurricanes, stuff like this? So that's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned that, okay, the elasticity is becoming more elastic or something like this, but maybe for household, is it true for manufacturing? Is it true for constructions? Is it the same? How do you see that elasticity moving forward? Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And you said you're from somewhere, Canada? What?
PEI, Instability Island.
Okay, all right, from PEI. Okay, great. So the questions, just to summarize for the people online, are about natural disasters and the risk that natural disasters will wipe out energy infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure. Is there some kind of insurance asset? And then a question about Amy's claim about oil markets, fossil fuel markets becoming more elastic. Wondered whether that was true also for commercial.
Okay, two outstanding questions. If a hurricane or similar disaster knocks out a natural gas peaking plant, that could be a 2-year process to repair. if a same disaster knocked out a utility scale solar farm and battery storage temporarily, that is a 1-week repair. So the opportunity in, at least for solar, community solar systems and utility solar systems are amazing. And indeed, we know in Puerto Rico, when they had the problems that they had, they were able to go to hospitals and other locations that were key, important locations, and Tesla and other companies were able to actually install services in a very short period of time, matter of days. So, so I would say, and also some of these events that happened in Texas with storms and so forth, the wind towers have been actually surprisingly resilient. So, but I'm not as studied on that to tell you how fast that can be repaired, but it's probably not worse than fossil fuels. So I would say in balance, not worse, maybe better, in general for renewables. Do have to worry about hydro and drought. Brazil's had a lot of problems with that. Other locations, France had that problem with nuclear because nuclear requires a lot of water. So we still haven't worked out some of that balance. On manufacturing and construction, we're not going to, let me rephrase that so I don't get a million attacks on Twitter. It is very hard to electrify high heat. It's possible, expensive today. I'm sure there are some groups that are working on it, but a lot of people are looking at the solution for that to be something related to either hydrogen or carbon sequestration and capture and sequestration. So I would agree that household and transportation is becoming more substitutable, and that manufacturing is less, but you are moving to things take in the European context and to some extent in the United States, especially California, where we're using waste energy. So we're making the natural gas from renewable sources. So again, less tied to fossil events. And even in aviation fuel, we're moving to sort of synthetic type of fuels, e-fuels, and also some biomaterial type fuels. So again, a little bit decoupled, but not as strongly as, of course, in electrification. In construction, I don't think we've made a lot of progress in construction. And so that is probably still more tied to high heat and traditional fuels. And so therefore, that's like the last frontier, I think, of decarbonization.
Do others want to?
Anybody else want to comment?
So I guess just on the first question about natural disasters, I think it's clearly an area that warrants further study. I know some of the national labs are doing work along those lines. I think if we're moving towards a system that has higher rates of electrification and then the grid goes down, that means people are now more reliant on electricity and become more vulnerable. We need to understand that better. And then in terms of, resilience to these disasters, one piece of work that this was prior, this has nothing to do with the EIA, but when I was still at NC State, there was some collaborative work that was led by researchers at University of Virginia, where they looked at the Puerto Rican grid and explicitly considered future hurricane risk and how you would rebuild, how would you build the system out with that explicit consideration of hurricane risk. And what they found was a move towards more renewables.
Just really quickly to add, I think that the solutions that I presented as preventative solutions for energy and security also pertain to preventative solutions for resilience. And they have to do with providing clean energy and more efficient access to households or localized units. So note that there's a key here, and that's the scale. And that I believe that there is the need for a long range of scale of technologies in order to build resilience going forward.
Hi, this is Silvia from German Council of Economic Experts and also NYU Policy Integrity. So I will speak to the more global aspect coming from Europe now. The policymakers have been pushing hard for changes in energy policy, especially they push emphasis on friendshoring. Do you see any merits to that? And then related to that, what capacity do you see for cooperation between Europe and North America? There has been a lot of push, and we spoke about how actually the new energy sources make us more localized, but hydrogen could break that down. So do you think hydrogen will kind of bring us together, or are we going to kind of go our own ways and just cooperate with technologies?
Great questions. I'll summarize. So the first question was about friendshoring, and this is a question from Sylvia from the German Council of Economic Experts and NYU. Question on friendshoring, which I would characterize as really a question about the national security issues that are being used, or the national security arguments that are being used as justifications for working with friends and partners and excluding imports from tax credits or from whatever the consideration is. Second question was about cooperation between Europe and North America. I will let the panelists answer first, but I definitely want to take the moderator's prerogative and answer some of that. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's really important. I worry about what Andrew is saying about the pressures from the Inflation Reduction Act to get rid of carbon pricing. I worry. Yeah, I think the policy spillovers are probably the most important characteristics of any policy in the climate sphere, just because it is such a global issue. One thing that I'm working on where I see the potential for cooperation between Europe and North America is methane. So methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. Its effects are really immediate. So, you know, if we could reduce methane emissions tomorrow, that would be very useful in terms of reducing short-term temperature increases. As it turns out, the EU and the US are taking very similar approaches to methane regulations on companies. The US has a carbon, or not carbon, but a greenhouse gas price in the Inflation Reduction Act. If companies fail to, or if states fail to implement regulations, then there's a methane fee that kicks in. So something that I, together with a couple colleagues, are advocating is for multilateral, you know, first starting with transatlantic cooperation on methane regulations and some kind of methane border adjustment policy where we can both with sticks and carrots encourage energy producers to similarly clean up methane emissions. The estimates that you see from the IEA and from other agencies are that a lot of the abatement technologies or abatement strategies for methane are like zero negative costs. I know as economists, we get suspicious of things that are claimed to be negative costs, but it seems as though the opportunities are quite cheap for mitigating methane. So I think we should, I guess the high level comment there is there are differences in approaches, but there aren't all differences, and we should look for areas of commonality. Anyone want to comment on that or on the friendshoring and on the national security? I think those are good questions.
I just want to jump quickly on that question of methane, because I think that was a case where the US moving made a huge difference in Canada, because all of a sudden your entrepreneurs have a market that's 10 times as large right next door where we're comfortable working. They're working with the same engineering firms, et cetera. And I think that mirrors into Europe and other markets. So I don't know as much of the national security, but I think it really is that supply chain where you're comfortable working, where you already have networks that you can deploy technology, and then how that seeds and drives innovation.
I would just add a quick point, which is a big area for more research is in this area of offset markets and verification processes in offset markets, and sending students out with the skills to work in that area I mean, VC is moving into all these little companies, but you know, are they really doing it properly? I would say, you know, Question mark. So, so I would encourage everybody to think about your curriculum. And do you have carbon accounting? Do you have offset markets in your curriculum? Because that's going to be very important.
Decarbonization Bros account is gonna go after you on Twitter now.
All right, I saw a hand in the very back.
So my question is about addressing some of the energy justice issues that the panel discussed. One of the ways that the federal government is thinking about addressing those energy justices is through the Infrastructure Act spending. And thinking about trying to deliver 40% of the benefits of Infrastructure Act spending to vulnerable communities. But it seems as of now, they're thinking of those 40% of benefits being investing 40% of the money in vulnerable communities. But much of the research that many of us at this conference do find that living close to new energy infrastructure could have costs for communities. So how do we think about benefits from new energy infrastructure spending and at a systematic level, ensuring that new infrastructure spending and new utility spending is benefiting communities in the sense of creating net benefits rather than just building more things vulnerable communities that are already probably facing environmental injustice as well.
Great question. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Max Harleman. I'm assistant professor of public administration at College and State University.
Great, thanks. The question from Max from Georgia College State University was about the Justice 40 program that the Biden administration is pursuing that requires 40% of the benefits of the clean energy transition to benefit environmental justice communities, which have been defined by the administration. So the question was, is that the right approach? That we know that there are risks and potential harms that come from building energy infrastructure in communities. So should we think about a broader definition of benefits?
Yes. Yeah. I think you articulated very well an expansion of what I was arguing is a fruitful area of further research, and particularly equipping government with the right tools that they can use to analyze the decisions that they're making. So the Justice 40 initiative is in fact tracking the benefits from all of the investment through the bill, as well as through IRA and through a variety of other benefit and investments that are happening in our energy systems right now. And they are working extensively on tracking these benefits. And there's tools that you can go and look at to actually see which projects are being funded. But the benefits, as you point out, is only one element, right? There's so much more than just the tracking of benefits. There's the burdens, there's other benefits, there's other burdens. And so that's truly why I started with the framework of energy justice and thinking through the tenets, because I think that framework provides us with a nice way of itemizing, if nothing else, the various challenges and disparities that exist within our energy markets. And we need, as analysts, to figure out ways to combine all of those things into single or multiple analyses to inform decision making.
All right, middle there.
I have a question about energy markets and fragmentation and bifurcation in energy markets, whether members of the panel worry about this, how you worry about it, and what role for policy you see in responding to increase or decrease in fragmentation in energy markets.
Great. Tim Fitzgerald from Texas. The question was about fragmentation and bifurcation in energy markets and whether there's a role for policy. If the panelists agree that that's happening, and if so, whether there's a role for policy.
So I guess I would have to ask you the question back, because, you know, I think as we move more and more to electricity markets, they're going to be fragmented, right? So why does that matter? I think you have to ask the question, do I care whether I have a global market or not? So if my concern is having commodities be fungible, then the question is, what does fungibility look like in a localized way as opposed to a global way? Of course, the Russia crisis wound up that oil was much more fungible than people imagined. They thought that the quality of Urals was going to be a problem. That turned out that wasn't the case, right? What I would say to you is, I think the one place that no one's doing any research that gets to this question of global versus not global is actually the refining industry. So will we have, say, the state of California, which is a bit cut off from global gasoline and diesel markets for reasons that are bizarre. Would we have, I mean, Tim and I, you and I discussed that when we had the crisis with the price war, right? Do we have a problem if refineries close in a certain location because there's a higher rate of electrification of transportation in one place versus another, places in China, certain countries in Europe, California and the United States? Do we have a rational system? Because this gets to a justice question, Carly and others, which is, take the state of California, because I've actually been working on this a little bit. If more and more refineries close, then it's low-income people who are having an ICE engine car because wealthier people are having electric cars. We have more charging stations. Now we start to close gasoline stations because the flow rate for a gasoline station at UC Davis is probably pretty low compared to some other locations. You know, how do we ensure, if we're a policymaker, that we keep enough refineries open to service people who have the remaining cars or not? And I don't think that anyone has looked at that whatsoever. Certainly no one's modeled it. It's already an active issue in the state of California, because you could wind up in a situation where a refining company or companies, small group of companies, become a natural monopoly. And they're a natural monopoly serving a lower class, less affordable customer. And what is the policy around that going to be? To me, that is a bigger fragmentation question than whether with renewables, we're going to have less of a globalized system for energy trade. I would jump back to the question of hydrogen for one more minute, if everybody would permit me, right? I know that Australia, Chile, Saudi Arabia, there are a lot of players to some extent under the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States, that are looking at the potential to be exporters of hydrogen, either through ammonia or some other means. I think that if we really are going to build out massive renewables, I don't see why you wouldn't want to do your green hydrogen right where you are and not be dependent on buying it as an export. So maybe the export market for hydrogen could be a little bit more like early LNG, in that you're going to have certain countries that are the ones that have to buy it from the export market, and most countries or many countries that could actually have the capacity to make it on site.
I'm going to take the other side of that and say we're going to need more fragmented markets, particularly in electricity, because we're going to need to see very localized signals of whether it's energy capacity, frequency response, voltage support, power quality, whatever the case may be, that you're going to need locally. And local could be, you know, not necessarily one city, but certainly part of a city, part of a province, part of a state. And so I think we're going to need more markets to send more signals of the types of development we want, where we want it. And then, you know we need more transmission, but you only get transmission if you can send that signal that power is substantially more valuable in one place versus another. So I think for electricity, we're going to want deeper markets and probably more fragmented markets to, otherwise we're going to end up with development where we don't want it and not enough development where we need it.
I think we have time for one more question, and I see there's somebody in front, but I saw back one first.
This is Jesse from the bank. So I have a question related to in the past 3 years, like there is so much like uncertainty, like social global insecurity happens, like pandemic and war, and it's like changed many people's life, like young scholars' life as well. So my question is like, how do you feel about those instabilities, and how does that change any of your research agenda or like any activity agenda to respond to those instability? Because I think that's for related to my next question is like, is there any tips for young scholars from all over the world? Because I think here people from diverse background, like how we can respond to that as a young generation as well. And then the third one related is like, so as a field, it's like globally field for the energy research. So is there any still like common ground is this instability and the population versus population? Is there any like first the common ground things in us that you still need to drive as a field and emphasize and try to looking for population?
Great. So that's a very kind of wide-ranging, high level important questions for the last 5 minutes on the panel. I'll try to sum up it. So the pandemic, and sorry, this was from Kui Chi from Georgia Tech. So the first question was noting that the pandemic has brought a lot of uncertainty to people, and we've kind of realized how uncertain the world is and how variable things are. So has that changed the way we think about research question or kind of changed how we think about energy markets in general? The second question I wrote down, young generation. I forget the second question. Maybe some of the panelists remember it and can state it as they answer.
How do you, shift your research for younger scholars?
Okay, all right, great, thanks. How do you shift the research agenda for younger scholars? And the third question was about finding common ground globally on some of these questions.
Okay, I'm going to take that on. I like that question a lot. I've actually given some thought to that question together with the energy program officer at the Sloan Foundation. I know a lot of us are funded by Sloan. And one of the things that we've said, which Joe has kind of alluded to, but I'll be a little bit more explicit. So Joe is saying that you need to set your model up so that you don't have a single answer. And he's talking basically about sensitivity analysis, because you need to be able to change your assumptions and see what that matters, and especially in distributional matters. I would say that people really should actually plan to build scenarios into their model. That you should not be I mean, you can do your model and then do sensitivities and then have a second page about sensitivities. But when you do that, you still walk away wanting to walk in a room and say, here's my main result. And then, by the way, there's this other thing I did on the side. Okay, I don't believe in that. I think that we all need to move to doing scenarios. So you set up your model in a way that you know that your outcomes are going to be scenarios, and your scenarios are going to be set up to try to address key instabilities or uncertainties, right? And that could be, you know, temperature in some cases. That could be changes in income distribution or recession, changes in population. You know, everybody's model is 100% like population is the key driver of every outcome when you're doing energy modeling. And so if you use the lowest distribution of population growth versus the highest, huge difference, right? Everybody uses the mean, but what if it's not the mean, right? So I really feel like we have not done enough where we come in assuming a scenario. And I'll just tell a quick anecdotal story to that, and then I'm going to pass the mic. So when I was at Rice, we used to use scenarios routinely to do the LNG market, when we modeled the LNG market. And I went to Ken Medlock one time and I said, I want you to add a scenario where Russia cuts off Germany. And Ken says to me, Russia will never cut off Germany. That would be a dumb waste of time. And I said, no, I insist on the director of the program. You have to do a scenario where Russia cuts off Germany. And we did a set of scenarios where Russia cut off Germany. I think we did it for 6 months. And the outcome was so dramatic. And it showed that Russia would lose their market share like almost forever. And I can tell you that Gazprom asked for 200 copies of the printed version of that study because they wanted to be able to see the color chart of who would take their market. Right? So it was an important outcome. That study is probably still pretty important now. And then the other thing I would say is we just had a scenarios workshop at NYU with our students, and then with mentors like ourselves and from the professional companies. And one of the things that the students said was in all their scenarios, they had huge swatches of young people behavioral change. People becoming vegans, that affected the agricultural outcomes. All, people thinking about food, clothing, goods, plastics in totally different ways. And then Robbie Orbis was there, who's a very good modeler, and he had the comment, which I think is true, that we haven't really pushed ourselves to consider behavioral scenarios. We all just reject behavior and say no one's going to change how they behave, but that might be generationally incorrect.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry. I realize that we are past time, so why don't we end it there? And if you have thoughts that with the you want to share with the remaining three panelists, you can come up after the words. But please join me in thanking Amy, Kimberly, Joe, and Sanya.
Maybe ask this more about the maybe response. I saw, for example, that I started mentioning the AERE specifically yeah, it's this one.